This is the Friday, January 4th, 2019 version of the Market Plus segment. Joining us now is Sue Martin. Sue, welcome back.
Thank you, Delaney.
Well, Sue, we certainly have a lot to touch on here that we teased in the regular portion of the show, but I want to start out here first with hogs. This week we had, the latest case outbreak of African swine fever was almost 100,000 head herd, cold, completely cold. What size herd, does a size herd like that have enough impact in China's hog markets to have them turn to the U.S. for hog production or for pork, or is that still something that we need to continue to watch?
Well, I think first off, China is the world's largest producer of pork. They own half of the hogs in the world, and they still import. And they're going into their Lunar New Year, which is February 5th, and so the pork is one of the staples for the holiday season, along with veg oil to do cooking. I think what's happening is it's such an important item because the size of this facility that it broke out in, I think it was in Heilongjiang that it happened in, is one of the largest yet that it's showed up. And it's been found in almost everywhere there's hogs in the country. And so it's a big, big situation. So the Chinese government came out with regulations late this week and stated that any hog in a facility, they process hogs all from each section of the country in that facility. They cannot intermix different provinces, and they have to do blood testing. They have to draw blood, and if it shows the virus, the hogs are, of course, they're called anyway or processed, but the meat cannot go into the consumer chain or it has to be destroyed. The packing house will be closed for 48 hours, so for 2 days. I think it shows how concerning the situation really is, because the virus lives outside the host for a very long time, and it's being spread even by the movement of the meat.
Right.
And so it's a very big concern. Meat and bone meal or blood meal, so to speak, they found it in that, and they were putting some of that
feedstuffs too.
Yes,
I think,
and that was being put into feedstuff, and so that's having to be pulled away because they cannot prove if it's not there or it is. So I think when we look at what's happening in China, it's a big, big deal, and it's one that they can't hardly get their arms around. It's going to take, I'm going to guess, 3 years at least to get their arms around this, and even then it might take longer. So what's going to happen is, in the meantime, even though African swine fever virus does not affect humans, it's the thought process, the psychological process of thinking about it and being concerned. So Chinese people are starting to back away from their local or domestic product. And so importing pork is probably going to be a big thing. They can pull pork from, Europe. They can get it from Russia. Although Russia has African swine fever as well, and they can get it from Ukraine. But at the end of the day, we have, Smithfield Farms here that is owned by Xinwei, and so they can get product from there and move it over. But I think it's not only bullish to hogs, but I think it's more bullish to beef because they'll switch. And once they get a taste,
the Chinese consumers switching to beef instead of pork.
Exactly. And they'll eat cuts that we don't eat, like tripe and different things. But I think they'll make that switch. And once they get a taste for that, the thing we have to keep in mind is China has the world's largest, not world's largest middle class, because India has that, but it has the world's fastest growing middle class. And that's a draw for meat, proteins. And so it'll probably help with fish and chicken, but more so, I think it's going to be the beef market that really gets attracted. And of course, they've already made deals with JBS out of Brazil, and of course, JBS has packing houses here as well. And so I think it's going to be that exports of beef are going to continue to be very good, and the demand. But there's one other thing that I think is affecting the meat markets that is really not given enough credit to. And I've kind of talked on it once, I think, on the show a long time ago, but it's the immigration, the movement of people around the world, moving from the Middle East into Europe and through European countries, moving from Central America into the U.S. These people, if you look at the migration, yes, there's women and children in it, but the majority is young men. They like protein and meat. And I think that's made a big change on all this demand for meat in our global market.
Interesting. Yeah, the immigration factor isn't one we commonly hear, so I'm
No.
glad you brought that up. I think the other thing we teased during the show here a little bit was rice, which is also a huge staple to the Chinese diet, and I'm guessing that's why we've seen people import so much, or why we've seen China recently import rice. We've got a question from Rich, in Appleton, Wisconsin, who specifically asks that, Sue. He said, why did China borrow rice, and what U.S. areas benefit from this purchase?
Well, you'll have areas like in the South, and especially, and also out of towards California, that has rice. But I think rice, what's so important about it, one, it is a market for our rice growers that they didn't have. And so that's a good thing. But more importantly, it just shows a continued draw, a tightening of supplies globally and here in the U.S. as we continue to tighten our coarse grain supplies. Stocks to usage is very tight. Corn and wheat is coming down, and I think once we start getting into the spring and we find out how low the acres are on hard red winter wheat, we're going to, and maybe even the soft red, but especially the hard red, I think we're going to find again that rice going out the door to another export market is also another way of tightening our supplies again between coarse grains and interchangeable markets that we have. It's a bullish thing.
Yeah, I understand. What about, we talked also a little bit there, has South American weather, Brazil and Argentina, has that been priced into the soybean markets? You said, refresh us.
I think we have to some degree because we've been lifting, this week especially, we've been lifting on the talk of weather. And even wheat kind of got some of that too because of Argentine weather being so wet. And while the Buenos Aires Grain Exchange has not lowered their estimate on production of wheat, which is like 19 million metric tons, you still are hearing talk and rhetoric about concern that they could be losing another 2 to 3 million metric tons of that 19 million metric tons due to quality issues, and maybe moving it into the feed sector. So that's helped wheat kind of stabilize and get a little lift here too. But for corn, I think it's still a factor to come. And so as we move through the latter part of this month, they're forecast to continue to be dry. And the temperatures are more seasonably, but they're running in the upper 80s, low 90s. So we'll see what happens. But I think as we move in through February, it's going to be really key to be watching how well the crops come out, how the weather has been, because, here there's been that old saying, plant your corn in the dust and your beans will bust. Does that ring true for Brazil? I'm not sure, but I will say the safrinha crop, they had high hopes for that. They might find that they're over optimistic on that crop there too, which just adds another little support under our market.
Yeah. So we got a couple questions. I'm going to skip down on the list here because we don't usually get questions about cattle. So we've got a couple of great questions I want to get your thoughts on before we wrap up here. We've got Ryan in Dike, Iowa. He said, August live cattle, should we buy puts now or just let it ride?
I think I would, we have so much going on in the world. And we had a break here. We have timing for a low on Monday in the cattle, and that's hinted more towards feeders and fats, but up towards the front contracts. But I think what's going to happen is, because our indicators on the longer term, like the weeklies, are so negative, that we're going to get a bounce in the market, and I think the trade has now got attention that they were bullish, and all of a sudden now they're thinking, ooh, this market doesn't feel the same as it did. We better start hedging, and they're going to kind of cap those rallies. So I think what I would do with the stock market rolling like it is and talk about global economies being concerning, of which I think, currencies is one of the things they're going to be addressing in their talks with trade between the U.S. and China. But I think it's probably a prudent thing to buy some puts. That way, you've got yourself floored and you leave that top side open, because I'm very friendly cattle for this year. It's, like I said, it's one of my favorite markets for 2019.
And I think that sums it up nicely here for our last question. John in Chilton, Wisconsin said, Do you deem it necessary for the live cattle and feeder cattle markets to move in unison, or can they operate independently of each other? And what do you see for this year?
Well, they can operate independently, but this past year, for example, feeders led the way up and they led the way down and back up and back down. They've been a bigger mover. I think when we look at this next year, the indicators that I have on cattle work very well on cattle, and they're looking at the quarterly data. This is one of the reasons I'm very positive, is they're just getting a nice go, both fats and feeders. I think feeders, you know, when we look at the cow slaughter we've had this past year, and we look at, and I think cattle have been counted twice to some degree in our reports, but when we look at the feeders and the bitterly cold weather, you know, so far we've had these weather patterns hitting cattle country. And I think that that's going to really continue. Once we start those patterns, they seem to stay. And I'm looking at this weather. I mean, I love what we have going right now, but I'm afraid it's not here to stay. And when we start to turn back bitterly cold, I mean, if the blast could be that polar vortex air coming back out of Canada, I fear that the cattle aren't going to be putting the weight on as like they should, which adds to more feed usage. But I think that the demand for feeder cattle is going to be good this next year. I think feeders are going to surprise us how high they get.
All right, how high, Sue? How high are you thinking?
Well, you know, they got up in the 150s this last year. I'm thinking, first off, I think fats will go through 130. And I think the feeders will probably have a potential to get up around 170, 175.
Oh, wow. Okay. Sue Martin, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Join us again next week when we'll explore how one group of farmers are growing crops without sunlight, and Darren Newsom will join me at the Market to Market table. Until then, thanks for watching, listening, or reading. I'm Delaney Howell. Have a great week.